Welcome to the debate. Look at a medical textbook, and the human body usually looks like a perfectly engineered machine.
Yeah, it's very neat.
Right. The heart pumps, the lungs breathe, the nervous system fires. Everything has this clean, undisputed purpose.
Form follows function. We love those binary answers in anatomy, you know? We want a bodily structure to either be strictly necessary to our survival or, like, completely vestigial, like the appendix or wisdom teeth.
Exactly. But then you examine the intricate biological landscape of the male reproductive system, and specifically the prepuce, commonly known as the foreskin, and that neat engineering narrative completely falls apart.
It really does.
We're forced to navigate this space of deep evolutionary complexity. Is this highly specialized tissue an absolutely necessary organ with critical sensory and medical functions? Or is it an evolutionary leftover, like a developmental default whose biological importance is overstated when you look at its tendency to glitch?
It is the absolute definition of an anatomical battleground, because on one hand you have this incredible embryological homology, a shared developmental blueprint that we see across both male and female anatomy. But on the other hand, we have to grapple with the clinical realities.
Right.
When you weigh the localized benefits of the prepuce against its very real structural vulnerabilities, you start to see a system that looks less like perfect design and more like a biological compromise.
I see why you frame it as a compromise, but when I look at the medical literature detailing the timeline of human development, I see the exact opposite. I see a meticulously evolved, multifunctional organ.
Meticulously evolved.
Yes. The biological text lists 12 distinct protective, mechanical, and sensory functions for this tissue. Evolutionary biology simply does not retain a structure with that many highly specialized active roles unless it is critically necessary for the success of the species.
Well,
And to really understand why, we have to start at the very beginning of human development. We have to look at the indifferent stage of the fetus.
the blank slate.
Exactly. Up until about the 6th week of gestation, a fetus possesses what we call an indifferent gonad and an indifferent genital tubercle. There is no morphological difference between male and female anatomy yet. To drive that neutral tissue to become male requires an immense, energy-intensive cascade.
Right, starting up in the brain.
Yeah, the hypothalamus secretes a burst of gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. That chemical signal travels to the anterior pituitary gland, essentially waking it up and stimulating it to release 2 more hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, or LH.
And we should note, those are the exact same pituitary gonadotropins that act in females to promote gamete development and estrogen secretion.
They are. But in the male fetus, that LH has a very specific target. It hones in on the Leydig cells. These are the interstitial cells packed neatly next to the seminiferous tubules inside the developing testes. The LH hits these cells and basically turns them into testosterone factories.
Just a massive localized surge.
Right. It is this massive surge of testosterone that actively forces that indifferent genital tubule to grow, stretch, and differentiate into the penis, while the very specific fold of that tissue forms the prepuce. I'm detailing this intricate pathway because biological systems do not expend this level of complex, hormonally driven energy to build a structure if it doesn't serve a fundamental biological role.
I understand the energy argument, but I think it fundamentally misreads what is actually happening to the tissue. The body isn't expending energy to build a foreskin from scratch as some isolated, master-planned project.
Well, it is building it.
It's simply bathing a pre-existing blueprint in a different chemical environment. Every single human starts with that exact same indifferent tissue cluster. If a wash of testosterone arrives, it stretches and folds to become the foreskin. If that testosterone surge doesn't happen, it becomes the clitoral hood. They aren't just similar structures, they are literally the exact same tissue experiencing different chemical weather.
The homology is beautifully extensive, yes. The same swellings that become the scrotum in a male become the labia majora in a female.
Exactly. And my point is that just because a structure develops from a shared baseline under the influence of testosterone, that doesn't automatically confer absolute medical necessity to its final form. It is literally just the masculinized version of the clitoral hood.
But
It's the biological default of having that specific layer of tissue present at the genital tubercle. To call it an evolutionarily optimized necessity ignores the mechanism of its creation. It's just what that indifferent tissue naturally does when it is exposed to androgens.
Wait, hold on. You can't just label it a default to dismiss its utility. Saying the foreskin is just a developmental default is like saying the heavy rubber casing around a high-voltage wire is just default plastic.
That's a bit of a leap.
No, the casing is there because the energy traveling through the system requires intense protection to function. Just because the prepuce develops from a shared embryological baseline doesn't negate the fact that, in its final differentiated form, it executes highly specialized, localized defense mechanisms.
Localized defense mechanisms that are, constantly adapting to the environment.
More than adapting, they are actively constructing the environment. Let's look at how this tissue behaves in early life. During fetal development and into infancy, the inner mucosal lining of the foreskin doesn't just rest over the head of the penis, the glands. It is biologically fused to it. This fusion is called the synechia.
Right. The tissues are physically bonded together, acting as a single unit.
It creates a temporary biological seal, and that seal acts as a necessary incubation chamber. It allows the delicate mucosal surface of the glands to mature in a completely protected, sterile environment. Even after that fusion naturally separates as the child grows, the tissue remains highly active.
Right, with the secretions.
Yeah, it isn't just a dry flap of skin. It secretes emollient oils. These oils mix with shed epithelial cells to create a waxy protective barrier. It actively keeps the glands moisturized, soft, and defended against environmental pathogens and friction. It even acts as a physical shield for an infant against highly irritating substances like feces and ammonia.
Okay, let's unpack that protection argument because I think it severely distorts the evolutionary context. You just mentioned it protects the infant's glands from feces and ammonia. But an infant sitting in a concentrated pool of ammonia is a distinctly modern, human-made context.
How so?
We are talking about modern diapers. Evolution did not design a protective sheath over millions of years to defend against synthetic fabrics trapping acidic waste against the skin.
Well, while the diaper is obviously a modern invention, a developing infant's exposure to its own waste is a biological constant. Whether in a modern nursery or a prehistoric environment, providing a physical and chemical barrier against localized acidity and pathogens is a profound evolutionary advantage.
A barrier that frequently malfunctions, though. If we are evaluating this tissue as an indispensable, perfect design, we absolutely have to acknowledge its structural compromises. The most obvious clinical reality is phimosis.
Okay, sure, phimosis.
This is a condition where that very protective skin becomes too tight and forms a fibrotic ring. It literally cannot retract over the glands. It traps debris, it causes recurrent infections, and it can obstruct urine flow. This isn't just an inconvenience, it represents a critical structural vulnerability in the supposedly perfect evolutionary design.
I'm not denying that phimosis occurs, but pathology in a small percentage of a population doesn't erase the physiological purpose of the organ. I mean, heart valves sometimes fail and calcify. That doesn't mean a heart valve isn't biologically necessary.
It's not just an isolated pathology, though. Phimosis points to a much broader reality about this entire anatomical region. This specific developmental pathway is profoundly prone to errors.
Prone to errors?
Yes. When that indifferent tissue is folding and fusing under the hormone cascade you described earlier, things frequently go off script. The medical literature notes high rates of hypospadias, where the urethral tube fails to close completely during development, leaving an opening on the underside of the shaft.
True.
And you see epispasias, where the opening is on the top. There's even apholia, the complete failure of the genital tubercle to develop it all. My point is, the prepuce is a localized fold in a highly volatile, error-prone developmental system.
Framing it as a flawless necessity ignores how often the folding process itself is the source of the clinical problem.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The very fact that this region is incredibly complex and requires such intricate folding and fusion is exactly why the protective sheath of the prepuce is so vital. It acts as a necessary safeguard for these delicate underlying structures as they mature. But even if we assume that modern hygiene environments make its early life protective role less critical today, that doesn't explain its complex architecture in adulthood.
You're talking about the functional mechanics of sex.
Exactly. The ultimate evolutionary test of any reproductive organ isn't just how well it survives infancy, it's its mechanical and sensory performance during reproduction. If the foreskin were just a passive developmental shield, it wouldn't be wired into the nervous system the way it is, and it wouldn't have such a dynamic mechanical role.
Mechanically, the anatomy is well documented. When the internal chambers, the corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum, engorge with blood, the shaft expands dramatically. The prepuce provides the mobilizing skin that unfolds to accommodate that expansion. I'll grant the utility of the extra tissue to prevent tearing during an erection.
But it does much more than just passively unfold to provide slack. It actively reduces friction and chafing during intercourse, which is crucial for preventing microtears and tissue damage. More importantly, it is deeply sensory.
A highly sensitive interface, sure.
Right. The tissue is densely packed with erogenous receptors. It functions as a highly complex sensory interface. During intercourse, it is uniquely equipped to contact and stimulate the homologous female anatomy, specifically the G-spot. This isn't just a physical sleeve. It is a dynamic, lock-and-key sensory mechanism that facilitates the very act of reproduction.
And that is exactly where the argument for absolute necessity starts to look like a massive stretch to me. I view those sensory features as overlapping, redundant benefits rather than singular biological necessities.
How is it redundant?
When you look at the mechanics of human reproduction, the heavy lifting, the critical, non-negotiable necessities are all happening internally. The external skin's friction-reducing role is a peripheral accessory compared to the overwhelming biochemical force of the internal reproductive tract.
How can you separate the external mechanics from the internal biochemical process? I mean, they work entirely in tandem. The sensory feedback from the external receptors triggers the internal responses.
They work in tandem, but one is clearly driving the system. Let's look at the male reproductive system as a whole. The mechanical success of an erection isn't driven by the skin. It is driven entirely by internal vascular traps. You have an incredibly dense venous and arterial architecture. Blood flow is locked into the corpora cavernosa so efficiently that it can sometimes lead to severe conditions like priapism.
Right, the prolonged erections.
Exactly. A dangerous prolonged erection completely unassociated with external sensory stimulation.
But the external skin facilitates the necessary movement to actually utilize that erection.
As a secondary benefit, let's look at the actual biological goal of reproduction, fertilization. The prepuce plays virtually no role in the survival of the sperm. The sperm's pathway is highly protected and entirely internal.
Well, yes, they mature in the epididymis.
Matured deep in the epididymis, transported through the vas deferens, and then they are mixed with vital fluids. The seminal vesicles secrete a fluid high in fructose to give the sperm energy to swim. But the real star of the fertilization process, the true biochemical engine, is the prostate gland.
The prostate contributes roughly 30% of the seminal fluid volume.
Right. And we have to look at why it secretes what it does. Vaginal secretions are naturally highly acidic, maintaining a pH of around 3.5 to 4.0. That acidity is an evolutionary defense mechanism to kill off external pathogens, but it is also an actively hostile environment for sperm.
Right, sperm motility plummets.
Plummets in acidic conditions. They need a pH of about 6.0 or higher to survive and swim toward the egg.
So the prostate acts as a chemical buffer.
Exactly. The prostate secretes a slightly alkaline fluid packed with citric acid, acid phosphatase, and enzymes. This fluid physically neutralizes the acidity of the vaginal tract in real time, creating a safe biochemical corridor for the sperm.
Yeah.
Add to that the bulbourethral glands, which produce alkaline mucus to neutralize acidic urine left in the male urethra before ejaculation even happens. The entire internal system is a biochemical marvel engineered specifically to ensure fertilization. When you look at the sheer chemical warfare required to keep sperm alive, the external foreskin's role in reducing friction looks like a helpful aesthetic feature, not a core medical requirement.
I certainly don't disagree with the biochemical necessity of the prostate or the seminal vesicles. The way prostaglandins in the semen react with cervical mucus to cause reverse peristaltic contractions in the uterus, literally drawing the sperm upward, is incredible biology. But you are attempting to diminish the prepuce by elevating the internal organs. And evolution doesn't work like that. It doesn't build useless, highly innervated systems.
It builds redundant ones.
Evolution rarely wastes dense networks of specialized receptors. The biological imperative is to drive the organism to reproduce. The foreskin is packed with these receptors to create a sensory feedback loop. That lock and key mechanisms, stimulating both partners simultaneously, is deeply intertwined with the evolutionary success of the species. It ensures the reproductive act is initiated, maintained, and completed. You even mentioned earlier that some men achieve orgasm solely through prostate stimulation, often called the male G-spot because of how it responds.
Yes, reporting sensations remarkably similar to accounts of female G-spot stimulation.
Which speaks directly to the incredible homology we discussed at the very beginning. We are looking at parallel systems. In females, the clitoral hood protects the highly sensitive clitoral glands and facilitates sensory engagement. In males, the foreskin protects the gland's penis and dynamically unfolds to act as a sensory mechanism during intercourse. If you view the clitoral hood as biologically vital for female sensory and protective function, you must apply that exact same logic to its embryological counterpart in the male. Nature spent an immense amount of developmental energy to wire both of them.
Nature spends immense hormonal energy constructing a lot of things that don't always pan out perfectly.
Really?
Yes, the descent of the testes, for example, is a massive developmental energy expenditure. The cremaster muscle literally has to pull them down from the abdomen into the scrotum to regulate temperature for spermatogenesis. And sometimes it completely fails, resulting in cryptorrhizism, where the testes remain trapped in the abdomen. My point is that complex physiological processes are prone to varied, sometimes inefficient outcomes.
But the mechanism itself is still necessary.
The mechanism has utility. The prepuce is homologous to the clitoral hood, yes. It has a high density of receptors, yes. But to call it an indispensable evolutionary triumph ignores how easily reproduction succeeds without it. The human reproductive imperative relies primarily on the overwhelming biochemical force of the prostate, the maturation process in the epididymis, and the robust internal vascular architecture. The foreskin provides peripheral benefits, but it is not the main engine.
Well, I think we've mapped out the boundaries of this physiological debate quite clearly. To summarize my position, when we trace the prepuce from its complex origins, driven by that highly specific cascade of GnRH, LH, and testosterone, we see a highly specialized organ, not a default afterthought. It actively bonds with the cilia to create a safe incubation chamber for mucosal development. It secretes emollient oils to protect against both modern and evolutionary abrasions. And in adulthood, it dynamically unfolds to provide a crucial mechanical and sensory interface that stimulates homologous female anatomy. These distinct, protective, mechanical, and sensory mechanisms prove it is an indispensable, actively necessary structure.
And to summarize my perspective, while the foreskin shares a truly fascinating embryological origin with the clitoral hood, developing from the exact same indifferent tissue, its absolute necessity is often overstated in the literature.
Right.
When we observe its clinical vulnerabilities, particularly conditions like phimosis, where the tissue fails to retract, and contextualize it within a broader anatomical region, profoundly prone to developmental anomalies like hypospadias, its narrative of perfection is severely challenged. Ultimately, the primary indispensable drivers of human reproduction are internal: the alkaline secretions of the prostate neutralizing vaginal acidity, and the robust internal vascular architecture are what ensure reproductive success. The foreskin provides localized, overlapping benefits, but its absolute necessity is highly debatable.
Well, despite our contrasting views on just how indispensable it is in adulthood, I believe we both agree on the absolute marvel of that early developmental timeline.
Unquestionably. The indifferent embryonic stage is one of the most fascinating processes in biology.
The fact that a single neutral genital tubercle and its surrounding tissue can be so profoundly shaped by a temporary chemical weather system into such distinctly different yet perfectly homologous male and female forms is just staggering.
We certainly agree on that. The interconnectedness of our anatomical origins is profound. Where we will continue to diverge is on whether the final physical presence of the foreskin represents a flawless evolutionary triumph or a biologically redundant structure that carries its own set of clinical compromises.
Indeed. Studying these shared, homologous tissues reveals just how deeply interconnected human development truly is. We are all built from the exact same blueprint. There is so much more to explore in the anatomical and physiological text regarding human reproduction, and we leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the underlying biology and form your own conclusion.
It really does make you rethink how you look at a textbook. It's never as simple as it seems on the page.
Exactly. It turns out that when you step into the world of embryology and cell differentiation, the body isn't just a clean engineering manual with perfectly defined purposes. The structures we take for granted are actually profound biological puzzles, carrying the entire complex history of our evolution in their folds.